Okay. So we'll see if anybody joins us tonight. But for right now, it's me and Craig. And we just finished up chapter 1 last week. And the suttas that wrap up the corresponding chapter. And I'm not going to lie, that was difficult for me, and I hope I did okay by it. I can tell you that I definitely did my best. And we'll see if anybody joins. And so I didn't do any pre-reading tonight because I knew we weren't going to be reading any suttas. So I just, I didn't pre-read. So again, we'll see how it goes. But we're at the top of chapter 61. And again, this is chapter 2. This last set of texts appears in the Magga Samyutta, SN 45, a section of the canon devoted to short suttas about the path. Many of the supplementary factors listed in this set of texts seem to be referring to the arising of the path in its ultimate sense, because they are actually different ways of expressing the actual path factors. View, consummation, for instance, obviously refers to the perception of right action and right livelihood. But other supplementary factors in this set do seem to be preliminary to the initial step of embarking on the path: heedfulness, appropriate attention, and admirable friendship. Eliminating redundancies in all the above lists, we can arrive at the following 2 lists of supplementary internal and external factors. Internal factors: truthfulness, the ability to be observant, heedfulness, and urgency, and appropriate attention. External factors: admirable friendship and the voice of another. And yeah, I just want to pause here again, because again, you just see really clearly here how important the Buddha found our own effort to be, to reaching liberation, to reaching a state of unbinding. A lot of this is internal, and I think it also reflects what we were looking at last week when we were reading about what the Buddha sought in a student when he was alive and traveling the land and teaching. And so these internal factors might sound familiar, right? Last time I spent quite a bit of time talking about that idea of urgency, and whether or not that was maybe necessary, to be able to experience the liberation that the Buddha was talking about. And then, of course, external factors: admirable friendship, friendship and the voice of another, so that you're not just listening to the fabricated mind speak of your own head, right? Truthfulness is primarily the willingness to be truthful in reporting your conduct to your teachers. And there it is. Okay. And fellow practitioners. But it is paired with the ability to be truthful to yourself. If you can't admit your faults to yourself, you won't be able to admit them to others. And if you can't admit them to others, you tend to hide them from yourself. I think this is really, really radical. Really radical. And when I think about this, I think about the lengths that humans will go to maintain their own status quo. I mean, even if that means maybe staying in a relationship that's abusive or really painful, dangerous, maybe even, right? Or just staying in any kind of situation that could be dangerous or really not a friendly situation for the self, right? But we might stay because it's familiar, we recognize it, we've been there before. But there's so much in that. If we can't admit our own foibles to ourselves, if we can't recognize them in ourselves, then we'll never be called to speak them out loud to another. Here in the very next section, it cleared that up for me that yes, there's teachers, Sarah. So these are supplementary, but I'm just thinking about, so it sounds like here in Buddhism, you talk about your failings to your teachers and your peers, your fellow practitioners, the Sangha, perhaps. And isn't that interesting? Because that's such the backbone of the 12-step program. If you have any experience with that, you take a 4th step inventory, getting honest with yourself about the part that you've played, the part that you played in relationship with others, right? What was my part? What behavior do I demonstrate? Maybe there's trauma there. Maybe there's a reactionary trauma response. And maybe we don't recognize that it's there, except we know that it's there, right? We know that it's there. There's a certain amount of just willingness, humility, to admit I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect. I have flaws. I have faults. I get it wrong. I get things wrong. And that doesn't make you weak, But what I love about what the Buddha says here is that this very simple sentence, right, that really kind of describes the trap. You don't admit it to yourself, and so that you don't say it out loud. And if you don't say it out loud, then it becomes easier to just push it down, avoid it, right? Have another drink, have another cookie, spend another hour doom scrolling, right? So there's a calling there, right? A calling to ourselves, and in saying the things out loud, we're truthful. We're being truthful. That internal factor. In the 12-step program, I think they call it willingness. Become willing. Maybe to be truthful. I don't know. So the ability to be observant is frequently mentioned in the texts, but surprisingly rarely explained. The few passages that depict its meaning and action point to the capacity to see the connections between your own actions and their results, and to detect subtle levels of suffering and stress in those results. In this way, the ability to be observant is connected to appropriate attention, below and through appropriate attention to right view. And so I think that this happens, when you practice meditation. And I actually think that people can maybe get access to this idea of cultivating observant behavior in themselves in other ways as well. Like I think about what are some of the things that I've used, some of the tools I've used in my life that have helped me to become more observant about my own behavior, my responses, my habits of behavior, habits of mind, and to detect subtle levels of suffering and stress, right? So I have a bad temper. I actually kind of was always pretty scrappy. Even as a really little kid, I think I just kind of came into the world a scrapper. What a trip, right? So, yeah, I guess in Buddhism and Hinduism, there would be, karma. Before I really spent any time looking at my own behavior in my life, before I became willing, pliant, there were very obvious repercussions for my anger, really obvious ones. Nobody wants to be around an angry person, right? Nobody wants to be around somebody who, right? It's very uncomfortable energy to be around. And I also grew up being around it quite a bit. And it's not pleasant to be around that energetically, right? But then here's the interesting stuff, right? He's talking about this idea of the subtle levels of suffering that you can detect. So as I started to unpack my own anger through my own process of healing a lot of stuff, and now I'm kind of speaking to things I did that had nothing to do with Buddhism, therapy for many, 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 many years. And again, I mentioned the 12 steps, again, 2 decades for both of those. And until I was really able to look at what was underneath my anger, I wasn't really able to see the subtle ramifications of my anger. The way that I acted out my anger on myself in such kind of really sad ways, the way that I alienated people that I cared about, you know, because even though my anger was a trauma response, right, doesn't change the fact that it was my behavior, and so there were lots of subtle ways that it impacted my life, and even today it still does, when, it's my go-to when I'm stressed, it is 100% a trauma response. And what's great about, well, not just meditation, as I mentioned for me personally, but, the decision, to follow the Eightfold Path as best I can, but the whole 9 yards, is that it does really kind of require you to get really, really curious about all of those subtle levels of suffering and stress that our behavior creates. It's another way to think about karma, right? Especially, again, if you're coming at this from a secular perspective, and I realize, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, I realize there are many, many gods and hell realms and different, but, I'm didn't come up in that, and that's kind of hard for people to swallow if they haven't been enculturated in it. And so hopefully whoever's listening will have a little bit of compassion for the notion that the supernatural aspects of Buddhism are not an easy embrace if you didn't come up in it. But yeah, so maybe you have a hard time with the idea of kind of like more of a cosmic karma. I talked about this earlier on in the book, that, well, could you recognize that our actions have reactions? That it doesn't matter if our behavior is coming from a trauma place. Is it kind? Or is it harmful? Plain and simple. To me, there's a certain amount, again, of a radical just, does it matter? I know this is not a popular view right now. It certainly isn't where I live. But there is a certain amount of recognition, I would say, here in this idea, this ability to be observant and this ability to be truthful. Another way to think about radical truthfulness to the self is, and again, these are themes that you might recognize if you do 12 steps, that they come up in that model, right? But regardless of your intersectional conditioning, your race, your gender, your sex, your financial status, your social status, your culture, your physical or cognitive, functioning. There's a considerable amount of our life, all of that included in the pile, that we have no control over ourselves. We don't. We just don't. It's the reality. So, to my view, the great thing about Buddhism is that it's a path in attending to yourself. I know this sounds really selfish, but I think that a lot of people really misunderstand Buddhism. They just really don't get that part at all. When people who think that this is selfish, meditation is selfish, or I'd say it's the opposite. I think that you're doing that radical work so that you can really show up with people in radical compassion. And you know what? Radical compassion isn't always nice. It isn't always comfy. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it hurts. But that's how you show up authentically. So anyway, I think I might have just gone off the rails. I do that a lot, right? Heedfulness. Heedfulness is the ability not to remain complacent about your attainments. As long as you see that there are still sources of suffering in the mind, you exert yourself to act in whatever way necessary to ward off the dangers to which they could lead. I love this. And I'll just say that I know there's a lot of traditions in Buddhism. And again, I'm very ignorant. I say that every time, that I would never call myself a scholar. But I will say that I just want to add to this that, the idea of the bodhisattva, again, I'm very ignorant of the actual precise details from the culture that talk about the story of the bodhisattva. So I'm not even going to pretend to do that here, but I'll just say that you could think of the bodhisattva as someone who maybe has attended to all of this or has experienced some kind of unbinding, release from the fabricated state. Now in Buddhism, it would be, then the story would go that but they have chosen to not ascend, but to stay behind and to help others to awaken and to be alleviated from suffering. I'll say from my practice, that what drives me and has always driven me, and I don't know where that comes from, really. Again, just like I don't know where my the rage, that I've learned how to work with and be friendly with, and only let out when it's necessary, and then I'm really grateful for it because I'm not to be trifled with, But what drives me here, so that I don't become complacent, and I can certainly become complacent, but I am pretty disciplined. I know that about myself. I'm pretty disciplined. I think when I started out, this was true for me. And I'm not saying that I'm like some advanced, not at all. I'm just saying that my relationship to heedfulness, the thing that motivates my heedfulness today, kind of a couple decades into my practice, is very different than it was when I started, in my early 20s. Hello. Oh, goodbye. Okay. So when I started, my heedfulness was very much this. In fact, it was very easy to be heedful, because I was coming at all of this in the early days as a recovering addict. And I was so junked out, I told you for me, what was going on for me in previous episodes, but I was so kind of desperate. That sense of urgency, again, right, that the Buddha talked about, that it was easy to be heedful. Here the Buddha is talking about, as long as you see that there are still sources of suffering in the mind, right? So as long as you still see that, well, that's going to drive you to continue to practice, especially if what's driving you is addiction, right? So yeah, as I said, so that was how it started out. I found so much healing, through my own maturing in the Buddhist practice, that shifted at a certain point. And I don't know if mature is the right word. It probably is, right? I mean, it probably is considered mature to think beyond yourself. No offense, anybody, but, so when I started, it was all about me. Just, I want to feel better. I want to get better. All I care about is I just want to feel good. I just want to feel better. I realize that there might be people out there that, might have a point of contention with me on that. What's wrong with wanting to feel good? Yeah, I guess nothing. I don't know. I'm not in your shoes. I don't know what your situation is. I guess my question to you would be, to what lengths would you go to make sure that you continue feeling good, would be my next question to you, right? And then we could have a really good ethical conversation that would probably be lots of fun. Today, especially right now, okay? So I don't know if anybody listens to this at all, but I live in the West, and we're going to have an election in 4 days, and it's probably going to go down in American history as one of the most significant presidential elections in American history. And so where am I going with this segue here? So my practice has been able to help me 100% keep my head in this election. Like 100%. It's kind of remarkable, really. It doesn't, you don't have to look at COVID or the election to see how much humans are suffering. And as Buddha says, right, some of that suffering is externally induced, or in other words, it's induced by things that we have zero control over. We're all going to die. We're all going to be injured or experience pain, whether it be physical or maybe it will be emotional pain. So pain is unavoidable. Death is unavoidable. That's right, you technos, you heard me. At least today, as we know it, as what humans consider, still to my knowledge, most of us consider to be life, Homo sapien, at least our lives, right? We're going to die. And so there's the suffering that people create for themselves in trying to avoid those inevitabilities, right? We kind of talked about that previously as well. Today, heedfulness for me is what drives me and keeps me from being complacent today. Is that I just want to be as much of a help to others as I can. And so, what is helping to me? Well, I am Buddhist, so I don't help. But I show up on this server. I meditate on here every day, or every day as much as I possibly can. I provide lots of free classes and free things. My livelihood has always been about trying to plant a seed in people's minds that might get them interested in thinking about how they can work with their own mind, or the possibility that could that be a possibility. I would do that with my students all the time. Do you think it's possible that you could look at this differently? Do you think it's possible that you could look at this from their perspective, right? If they were arguing with someone or having a fight or disagreeing with someone. All of these things are quite Buddhist, right? What's happening in the US right now, how polarized we've become, our inability to talk to one another, is not Buddhist. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely not Buddhist. So to my mind, this idea of heedfulness, I've mentioned this on here before. Man, I have just been doubling down on my practice in the last several years. And yes, I recognize that can be clinging. And I do. I have to watch that on the regular. Sarah, are you clinging to your Buddhism because you're afraid of what you're seeing happening in your culture? I worry about young people. I worry about social media use, and I worry about what I perceive to be cell phone addiction where I live. I have to ask myself that, Sarah, are you using this as a distraction? You're doubling down, quote unquote, on quote unquote Buddhism, right? Because Buddhists don't label themselves, right? So, and I know that too. But then that goes back to this idea of truthfulness, right? I think that these are the kinds of conversations that we should be having with ourselves. Am I blowing smoke up my ass right now? I like to ask myself that question on the regular, right? And how do I know when maybe I need to ask myself that question? Something doesn't feel quite right. You meditate long enough, you really develop a meditation practice, and you become quite embodied, depending on the kind of meditation that you do. But certainly Vipassana, you become quite embodied. And so then what happens, at least this is my experience, is that so you become embodied, and then your body kind of lets you know. Your body lets you know when you owe someone an apology. Your body lets you know when maybe you reacted instead of acted. You said what you meant, but you didn't say it without being mean. Your body kind of lets you know, or your conscience. I don't know. I don't really deal in that. I deal in body more. Anyway, I'm going on and on here, and I want to get through this, but yeah, heedfulness. Urgency, samvega, is a sense of chastened dismay over the pointlessness of life as it is ordinarily lived, combined with a sense of urgency to escape from this pointlessness. Holy cow. Well, to me, this is a really great continuation of heedfulness. Something that I do think I'm seeing, at least, I'm a media psychologist, I'm a researcher, I'm getting my doctorate right now. So I spent a lot of time studying online conversations. I spent a lot of time looking at culture online and how we how we talk to one another, cultural shifts, political shifts, and the media's role in it, looking at different psychological frameworks as they apply to media consumption. And I feel like we're almost seeing this level of urgency on a really grand scale. And again, this goes back to the earlier episode last week talking about the artist and, the conversations that I've had. I've had this conversation so many times with fellow friends who are artists, whether that be musicians or painters or dancers or actors or writers, they spend a lot of their time, creating art and kind of losing themselves in the creative demon, or however you say that word. And many of them would tell you, look, you can't access it unless you've really, 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 really suffered. And so that could be the same thing that's being got at here, that to really be able to stay on the road to Radhaga, and not become complacent, see heedfulness. There is a sense of urgency there. I'm really seeing that happen right now with young men in my country. There's research that's showing this. There's a lot of online content, more and more and more in the United States that's coming out about this issue. That as the United States is undergoing a reckoning, about the more masculine aspects of Homo sapien, if you're a Jungian, anima animus, and this idea that it's been very male for a very long time. And in the past few years, the US has worked hard as a collective, many factions of it, many parts of it, to right what is perceived to be a wrong. And now you're seeing a conflation of the feminine. And you're seeing a lot of rage too, and you're seeing a lot of anger. I hear a lot of language coming from women in my country. Language like toxic masculinity, making white people be bad, making men be bad. You can't get there from there, But I think you already know that. Well, just don't be surprised, right? When you get more drama and conflict in your life. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You just can't get there from there. In other words, ladies, I'm a lady. If you really want to change the patriarch, then from my view, I would say the best shot that we have is to teach our young men and our young women to derive their strength internally, so that they're not playing out all of the fabricated bullshit that arises from cultural conditioning. We can't blame young men today for being culturally conditioned. How is that fair? I bet you if you were really honest with yourself, you would see that that's not fair. That's not right to do that. And that you're not going to that nothing good is going to come from that unless you can, I guess it depends on what you consider to be good. I mean, everybody's got different views on that. Some people believe that tearing people and things down is good and needs to happen. I'm just, I'm Buddhist. I don't agree with you, if that's your view. I don't think you can get there from there. So, if we keep behaving the way that we're behaving to ourselves and each other, well, this urgency is inevitable. We'll be driven into it. And, we'll just live out what feels like a very pointless existence. And there are plenty of people who do that. That was my dad. Love you, Dad. But it doesn't have to be that way, It doesn't matter what happened to you. It doesn't matter what your skin color is. It doesn't matter what your gender or your sex is. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be that way, you know. I mean, it will be that way if you think it's going to be that way. I mean, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right then. Yep, you're right. What the thinker thinks, the prover proves. You must be right. Right? Appropriate attention. So sorry if I get this wrong again. Yoniso manasikara is the habit of asking yourself the right questions. On the transcendent level, this means asking questions in terms of the Four Noble Truths and their duties. Detecting, say, when there is clinging to a particular aggregate, and investigating how that fact can be comprehended. In the beginning levels, though, appropriate attention means focusing on questions concerning your own actions and their results. We just talked about this, right? Looking for ways to reduce the harm and suffering caused by your actions, and avoiding questions that would direct your attention elsewhere. This quality thus works hand in hand with heedfulness, in that both are based on a conviction in the efficacy of action. So I don't think I need to say anything else on this, right? We just really just talked about this quite a great deal. Admirable friendship is a quality with a double meaning. On the one hand, it refers to the friends you choose. In particular, you want to look for friends who embody the principles of conviction, virtue, generosity, and discernment. On the other hand, it refers to the quality of the friendship. You try to emulate those qualities in yourself. To aid in emulating these qualities, the Buddha recommends that when you have found a friend who embodies them, you should treat that friend with utmost respect. Oh gosh, I love this. And but remember the idea of feeding. Feeding. What are you feeding your mind? People feed our mind. They do. And when we spend time with people, they feed our mind. When we talk to people on the phone, it's feeding our mind. When we're texting and we're chatting and we're voice messaging and we're feeding. So, I think, Siddhartha's telling us here that, it's actually important who you have in your circle. So, we are the people that are in our circle. You want to see how you behave. You want to see what you value. You want to see what matters to you. Take a look at the people that you hang out with. And if it doesn't reflect what matters to you, then maybe you should think about admirable friendship here and ask yourself, then why am I spending time? My precious life, right? Coming back to that idea of my precious life. Your precious life. There's so much to be done. There's so much to be done. Why are you squandering your precious life on friendships that aren't admirable? The voice of another is rarely mentioned in the canon and never explained, as I noted earlier, right? It's like, wow, you just you just don't hear the Buddha talking about other people, right? Other people feature so prominently in Christianity and Judaism, and it's really interesting to me. Buddhism is just, and if anybody's listening and maybe you know of another religion or philosophy, depending on how you view Buddhism, that holds this so sacrosanct, I'd love to hear about it. I don't know of any other that holds the action of the individual as above everything else. Everything else. And maybe that's why the canon just doesn't really spend a whole lot of time talking about people outside of the individual, right? Because it's pretty clear in the Eightfold Path that we're not to look to people outside of ourselves. It's on us. People can't walk the road to Radhaga for you. People can't decide to not go visit the village or the town while walking the road to Radhaga for you. You have to decide. As a result, many explanations for the term have been suggested over the centuries. Primarily, it seems to mean the voice of an admirable friend teaching Dhamma. But it could also refer to the voice of a person expressing a view that is not Dhamma. You listen to it with appropriate attention. And in detecting what's wrong with it, you articulate for yourself what would actually be right view. I love this. This is so great. Let me tell you who the voice of another has been for me for this past month or two. AI has absolutely met the criteria for the voice of another as Bhikkhu translates the Pāli Canon here. So AI, AI is, depending on who you ask, I am not in the camp that AI is consciousness. I know some people do believe that AI is consciousness, as humans are conscious, but I do know the Eightfold Path, And sometimes just having conversations with AI, even though I know it hallucinates, especially because it hallucinates, I like to get in there and have Socratic conversations with it. Answering every question that it gives me with the question, when it gets it wrong, providing it with information that comes from, well-reputed sources, and then asking it to, so this is this idea of even, the voice of another doesn't have to be someone who's teaching the Dhamma. And, right now I don't actually have a Buddhist teacher. I like to be with a Buddhist teacher in person, and, my family's getting ready to move, and I want to wait until we move to our forever home before I establish a new relationship with a Buddhist teacher. But Bhikkhu, in a way, is my Buddhist teacher. I'm reading this book. And AI, in that it forces me to make sure that I'm fact-checking it and getting it right. All right, gosh, there's only 5 more minutes left. Oh my gosh. Well, I'm just going to go for it. These supplementary factors support one another. On the internal level, heedfulness and urgency give a sense of urgency to appropriate attention and to your powers of observation, and inspire you to be truthful. Truthfulness allows appropriate attention to be accurate in detecting areas of your actions that still need work. And appropriate attention keeps heedfulness and truthfulness focused on the task at hand, while balancing the terror of urgency with a sense of confidence that there is a way out through developing skill in your actions. Right? That's that map. My gosh, thank goodness there's a map. Thank goodness there is a map that you can follow. Admirable friendship is an external factor. Also influences your internal factors. In teaching you generosity, for instance, it helps you to overcome the stinginess that, as notes, can get in the way of right concentration and the higher attainments. In teaching you discernment, it encourages appropriate attention and heedfulness. The internal factors also play a role in making the external factors possible. Truthfulness is what allows you to detect a person of integrity who could act as an admirable friend. And it, together with the ability to be observant, is what would inspire an admirable friend to develop a friendship with you. Even the Buddha, as an admirable friend, did not want to take on a student who lacked these 2 qualities. We just talked about this, right? Feeding. As these supplementary factors develop, they not only provide the conditions to support the path, but some of them actually develop into path factors. Appropriate attention and the ability to be observant develop into right view. The ability to be observant combined with truthfulness develops into alertness, one of the sub-factors of right mindfulness. Truthfulness develops into right speech, and heedfulness and urgency become 2 of the motivating factors for generating the desire to engage in right effort. 2 sets of texts from the canon are especially helpful in showing how these supplementary factors assist one another in giving rise to the path, at the same time showing some further qualities that they engender when developed together. The first set of texts consists of those in which the Buddha tells of his own quests for awakening, when he was still a bodhisattva, a Buddha to be. The second set consists of 2 connected lines of instructions that the Buddha gave to his son, Rahula, when the latter was still a young child. So I think I'm going to stop right there. Okay. Didn't get very far today, but that's okay. So we'll start off next week on the Buddha's autobiography. Because, yeah, it would be a shame to start off on that fascinating tale and have to finish it later. But we will absolutely get into his autobiography and his instructions to his son next week. Thank you. If you're listening to this, thank you. And I hope you're doing well. And take good care of yourself. Appreciate you. Bye.